In our next section of the peripheral nervous system, we will discuss the reflexes. Reflexes are described as automatic, rapid, and involuntary responses to stimuli. They're considered automatic in that they can occur without conscious input from the central nervous system. However, we will see that certain reflexes can be modified by conscious control. The events that occur during a particular reflex always happen in the same order every single time. So for this reason, reflex events are quite predictable, and the neural pathway that controls a specific reflex is the same neural pathway that is activated every single time. The neural pathways that control reflexes are called reflex arcs, and they consist of 5 components: the receptor, the sensory neuron, the integration center, the motor neuron, and finally the effector. The receptor is the structure that detects the stimulus, and it begins a reflex. So in this example, the stimulus is a pin that has pierced the skin and causes nerve endings to send information about that painful stimulus to the spinal cord and to the brain. The sensory neuron serves as the line of communication between the receptor and the central nervous system. The integration center is part of the central nervous system that controls the reflex. So in this example, an interneuron in the spinal cord receives input from the sensory neurons of the skin, and then it decides how to appropriately respond to that particular stimulus. The interneuron here serves as the integration center. The motor neuron is the neuron that signals the body's response to the stimulus. The motor neurons are the same neurons that control our voluntary or involuntary muscles, and here they are used to carry out the body's response to that initial stimulus. The motor neurons communicate with effectors, so that is muscles or glands, that carry out the body's response and make that reflex happen. Reflexes are generally categorized by their effectors, that is, which muscles or glands are activated as part of that reflex. The somatic reflexes are those reflexes that have skeletal muscles as their effector, while autonomic reflexes have smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands as their effectors. Reflex arcs can also be described by how many synapses are present in that particular reflex. Monosynaptic reflex arcs have sensory neurons that synapse directly with motor neurons, while polysynaptic reflex arcs have sensory neurons that synapse with one or more interneurons within the central nervous system. So recall that these interneurons would then have synapses with motor neurons that are carrying out the body's response to that stimulus. So let's look at some specific examples of reflexes and how they work. We'll begin with the somatic reflexes. One type of somatic reflex is called a stretch reflex. Stretch reflexes can occur in any skeletal muscle, and they help to keep the muscles at a constant length. This helps us to maintain balance and posture, and stretch reflexes occur when muscles experience or are subjected to undesired stretch. The stretch reflexes begin when a skeletal muscle is stretched out. Clinically, we can test stretch reflexes using a reflex hammer. So in this example shown here, one of the easiest stretch reflexes to test are the stretch reflexes of the quadriceps femoris muscle group on the anterior part of the thigh. If we tap the patellar tendon, which is just distal to the tip of the patella bone, we can stretch this muscle out. Specialized sensory receptors within the muscle, they're called muscle spindles, will detect this stretch, which causes a sensory nerve to fire. The sensory nerve extends all the way to the spinal cord, where it delivers its information directly to a motor neuron. These motor neurons have synapses with the quadriceps muscles, and when the motor neurons fire, they cause the quadriceps femoris muscles to contract, thereby resisting the initial stretch stimulus. If a patient is sitting on the exam table with their knees hanging over the edge of the table, we see that the response of this reflex when the leg extends and kicks outward. Again, any skeletal muscle is capable of producing a stretch reflex. This particular reflex just happens to be one of the easiest ones to demonstrate clinically. Notice that this is a monosynaptic reflex arc because the sensory neuron synapses directly with the motor neuron. We also see that the response occurs on the same side of the body as the stimulus. Therefore, we would refer to this as an ipsilateral response, because the prefix ipsi means same. Other somatic reflexes include the withdrawal reflex and the crossed extensor reflex. The withdrawal reflex is a response to a painful stimulus in a limb. Sensory receptors that detect pain in the limbs communicate through sensory neurons to interneurons within the spinal cord. Those interneurons then communicate with relevant flexing muscles within the limbs. So for example, in this diagram, the biceps brachii is a flexor of the elbow. The flexor muscles will then flex the limb. And in doing so, they're going to withdraw the upper limb or the lower limb from the painful stimulus. So notice that this is a polysynaptic reflex, as the blue sensory neuron communicates with a chain of green interneurons within the spinal cord. The response is an ipsilateral response because the purpose of this reflex is to withdraw the same limb that experienced the pain from that painful stimulus. It of course wouldn't do any good if the contralateral or opposite limb from the initial painful stimulus was withdrawn. The crossed extensor reflex is a reflex that accompanies a withdrawal reflex, particularly in the lower limbs. Stepping on a painful stimulus triggers a withdrawal reflex in that particular limb, so that is, the ipsilateral limb that experienced the pain. In the contralateral limb, the crossed extensor reflex is initiated. The same sensory neurons that begin the withdrawal reflex will also trigger the crossed extensor reflex simultaneously. Those sensory neurons will communicate with many interneurons in the spinal cord and activate motor neurons that control extensor muscles in the contralateral limb. So that is the limb that was opposite of the stimulus. These extensor muscles will then contract and keep that leg straight in order to maintain balance during the withdrawal reflex. The examples so far have been somatic reflexes, which all use skeletal muscles as their effectors. However, let's briefly turn our attention to the autonomic reflexes, which have smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands as their effectors. One example of an easy-to-demonstrate autonomic reflex in the lab is the pupillary light reflex. So first, a little introduction to the anatomy of the eye is necessary. The pupillary light reflex is a reflex of the eye. The iris of the eye is the pigmented ring at the anterior aspect of the eyeball. So not only does the iris contain pigment, but it also contains ring-shaped bands of smooth muscle. This reflex controls the size of the pupil that's in the center of the iris, and it's the pupil that controls how much light that enters the eye and falls on the retina, which contains the sensory receptors of our eye. Light that is too bright can damage our retina, so the pupil tends to constrict to let less light into the eye, while dim light causes the pupil to dilate and let as much light into the eye as possible. So the reflex arcs control autonomic reflexes just as they control somatic reflexes. The reflex arc for the pupillary light reflex is as follows. We see that there are sensory receptors located in the retina that detect light levels, and those sensory receptors in the retina then communicate with sensory neurons in the optic nerve, which is cranial nerve number 2. And this nerve carries that sensory information to the brain. The brain then acts as the integration center for the stimulus. The oculomotor nerve, which is cranial nerve number 3, carries motor commands to the smooth muscle of the iris. And the effector of this reflex is the smooth muscle of the iris. So in bright light, the pupil will constrict, while in dim light, the iris will be dilated. The response of the pupillary light reflex is what we call consensual, so that is, both sides of the body respond equally to the stimulus, even when only one eye receives that stimulus.